Welcome to the Pharmacist Podcast, episode 306. I am your host and Ohio pharmacist, Kim Newlove. My guest today is another Ohio pharmacist. It's Dr. Tim Ulbrich, host of Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast. Links to Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, Tim's business website, his social media channels, and more are in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. This is the 8th episode in my Pharmacist Podcasters Series. If you are new to this series, welcome. You can check the show notes for the links to the other 7 in this series. My guests and I talk about podcasting. We want to inspire you to start your own podcast or be a podcast guest or just use your voice in general. If you're interested in podcasting or public speaking, you will like this episode. By the way, if you need help starting your own podcast, I can help. I help pharmacy professionals start podcasts. Whether you're a pharmacist, a student, a technician, an owner, a professor, whoever you are, I can help. I know what it's like to be at the beginning of that journey and not know the first step. Check out my free resources. I have a free ebook and audiobook about podcasting. I have many podcast episodes about podcasting. I have this Pharmacist Podcasters Series. I also have a self-paced online course, which is $249, and you can also book time with me one-on-one. There's a lot of options. I have a lot of free content out there, but I also have some coaching opportunities as well. I absolutely love podcasting, and I would love to help you start your own podcast too. Head over to my online store to learn more. That is kimnewlove.com. Links in the show notes. Next up, I'll tell you a little more about my guest, Dr. Tim Ulbrich, then I'll roll the interview. Dr. Tim Ulbrich is the co-founder and CEO of Your Financial Pharmacist. Founded in 2015, YFP is a fee-only financial planning firm and connects with the YFP community of more than 17,000 pharmacy professionals via the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, blog, website resources, and speaking engagements. Tim received his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from Ohio Northern University and completed postgraduate residency training at The Ohio State University. From 2009 to 2021, he worked in various academic and administrative roles at Northeast Ohio Medical University and The Ohio State University College of Pharmacy. Tim is the co-author of the book 7-Figure Pharmacist and host of Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast. He has presented to over 200 pharmacy associations, colleges, and groups on entrepreneurship, leadership, and various personal finance topics, including debt management, investing, retirement planning, and financial well-being. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Tim Ulbrich. Hi, Tim. Welcome back to the Pharmacist Voice podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well, Kim. Thank you so much for having me back.
My pleasure. This is your three-peat, sir. This is your third time. Very few have done it. But I'm happy to have you back. I know that
Grateful.
I think the first time we talked about you being a dad, the second time we talked about your book, 7-Figure Pharmacist, and now we're going to be talking about your podcast.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. We have the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. So we've been at it now for 7.5 years, Kim. Can you believe that? So it's been a really fun journey.
I'm applauding over here from Northwest Ohio. I know you're also in Ohio, aren't you?
Yes, Columbus. Mm-hmm.
Yep, I've been a longtime listener. Yep, and I love one particular kind of episode. I know we haven't talked about your format and what you talk about necessarily in depth, but one of my favorite kinds of episodes that you do is the debt elimination episode, where there's a pharmacist who had all the student loan debt. And I think I recently reached out to you about an episode and I said, I love this type of episode so much. I would love it if you would put together a list of them so I could just binge those because it's my favorite. On your podcast, what are the different types of formats you use? Are they all solo shows or what kind of formats do you have?
Yeah, now that we've been doing it for a while, I will say there's some rhyme and reason to the type of formats that we use. But for anyone who's listening, who's maybe on the front end of this journey or thinking about a podcast, I'd be lying if I said that from day one, we knew exactly what we were doing. It was very much figure it out, get started, see what really resonates with our style, see what our community, really is interested in. As you mentioned, you really enjoy the debt-free stories. So for some people, we get a lot of great feedback about those. Other people like to hear real estate stories, or those that, have achieved another financial goal in particular. Some like to hear more of the educational, types of things that we do where we teach on a topic. So the formatting has been all over the place. And I would say where we're at today, it's a combination of stories. That could be a debt-free story. That could be a millionaire theme hour. That could be a giving story. That could be an entrepreneurial story. So really highlighting someone's journey and story, where they started, what that journey looked like, where are they at today, where are they going into the future. And I think for obvious reasons, people really like those. Not so much that they may hear someone's story and say, "How am I going to go do exactly what that person did?" But we all like to learn through stories. And I think that even if it doesn't directly apply to us, there's usually something when I hear a story that I can pull out and say, "Oh, that's interesting," or "I hadn't thought about it that way," right? It opens up some of the creative thinking that can come out of the financial plan. And it brings life to a topic that can be pretty boring, if we're honest, right? I always say that, when we talk about your financial pharmacist, nothing is new that we talk about. There might be a new, wrinkle to a financial topic or a new angle that we bring, but investing, retirement planning, debt management, home buying, real estate, all of the topics of the financial plan, people have talked about these for many, many, many years and many different formats. And our opinion is just one, right, that we've added to it. But what does bring life to it is the stories where people can connect to it and say, "Oh, like I've heard someone talk about or drone on about investing, but it means something different because of how it was presented. And it leads to someone being motivated or empowered or educated in their own financial plan." And that for me is a big goal of what we're trying to do. So that's one format, would be stories. We also do a lot of what I call educational content. So I might talk with one of our financial planners, like my partner, Tim Baker, where we talk about a specific topic with a goal of teaching. That could be Social Security, right? That could be debt management, could be investing or investing strategy. So less story-based, more educational and information in nature. And then the third format I would say we've done is where we'll answer questions that we get from people in our community. So these could be people that listen to the podcast, that read the blog, that just reach out on social media to say, "I have a specific question." And these can be very narrow, or they could be a little bit broader. And we take their question, and sometimes they're comfortable recording that question, and then we'll actually play the recording in the episode. Sometimes they're not, and that's okay too. And I'll just read the question aloud. And then we'll answer that question, trying to really bring some of those real life scenarios to life. So those I would say are the three main types of episodes that we're doing.
Thanks for laying that out for me. I know that you have sometimes solo shows. I think one of the types that you mentioned was the Q&A type thing where you crowdsource a question from your YFP community, answer it there and push it out as a podcast. That's awesome. Sometimes you have the interviews like you mentioned, which is great. I love that your goal is to relate to other people, because I think that's what it's all about. It's not about you trying to position yourself as the expert. It's more about trying to be from a place of service and take math, which is, it can be kind of a boring, dry subject, and you put life into it. You show what it's like, or what it can look like when somebody has $160,000 of student loan debt and then they pay it off. What does that look like? What's the story? How did they transform from this person in debt to being debt-free?
Absolutely. And I think it brings it to life. It provides a source of motivation and inspiration. Again, even if someone, I'm thinking of Brandon Gerleman's episode that we did not too long ago. You mentioned the 160, right? That was Brandon who, his journey, him and his wife paid off that debt very aggressively, primarily by using refinancing as a strategy to lower the interest rates. And the listeners might look at that and say, "Well, Tim, in 2024, like refinancing isn't really a big thing because interest rates are much higher." And, Brandon had much lower interest rates. True, but that wasn't the essence of the story, right? It was about, for Brandon and his family, finding what is the debt repayment pathway that makes the most sense for them, and what's the why behind that. That's what I'm always trying to uncover, right? When we talk about the financial plan, X's and O's, whether it's debt management, investing, whatever, there's always important strategies, but underneath that, if we can really do some of the work to uncover some of the emotions and the goals, there's often an anchor that is driving what we're doing. And if we're clear on why we're doing what we're doing, my belief, my experience tells me that we're more likely to achieve our longer term goals because we've got that source of motivation. We have that fire that's really driving what we're trying to accomplish in the financial plan. So absolutely. I do drone on from time to time. I will talk about a topic. I'll provide my opinion. I think there's a place for that. It's important. It's something that I enjoy to do as well. But the data does tell us that people want to hear other people's stories. So there are some solo episodes we do, but predominantly it's an interview type of style, either with a pharmacist sharing their story or even an interview style with one of our financial planners or someone who's on our team.
From my experience as a listener, both work for me. I am not only entertained, but I feel like I'm getting educated. You mentioned that is kind of one of your goals. You wanted to have education be a piece of this podcast. One of the things that happens by accident, just kind of along the storytelling route, is that people get vocabulary. They learn terminology.
That's right.
They wouldn't normally pick up, because when you look at numbers and you look at opportunities to eliminate debt, you don't always know the nuances. And when you talk about it through story, people pick up on the terminology. Even just talking about goals and goal setting, some people don't know what their options are for goals. I know people want to be debt-free, but having a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, or finding out what's possible, refinancing. You mentioned refinancing just a minute ago. Some people don't even know that's an option. So I think you bring out all kinds of great terminology and vocabulary just by telling a story.
Yeah, Kim, I'm so glad you mentioned some of the terminology that people will pick up on over time. We actually have seen, which is really cool as a part of this work, people using more of the terms that we like to take part credit for, just some of the awareness and the financial literacy that's coming from the podcast is one source of that. So the number of people that come forward that are using terms like public service loan forgiveness strategies, or nuances of, different investment strategies, or understanding the alphabet soup of retirement accounts. It's really cool to see the financial literacy and awareness that grows over time. And I think that's one of the main reasons that I was so passionate about starting this at the beginning, is that when I went through my own journey of navigating a couple $100,000 of student loan debt, I really had to have a wake up call of, hey, I just finished a doctorate level pharmacy program, but I probably have maybe a third, fourth grade level financial literacy, if I was honest with myself at the time. And really, so much of the momentum and the financial plan comes from building that base of one's financial literacy, education, and knowledge, that some people are further along and some people are not. So really doing a self-assessment of where are you at in terms of your financial literacy. And we hope to help grow that through the education that's on the podcast, while also layering on some of the stories and transformation that can happen as well.
I appreciate that. Financial literacy, that's a good term for what we're talking about, the vocabulary, the terminology. It's financial literacy.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if I hadn't had a classmate who brought their husband, who's a financial planner, into one of my 4th-year pharmacy school classes, I was a BSP student, so a Bachelor of Science in Pharmacy student. We only had 5 years of school. The 4th year out of 5, we had one single class where we had somebody come in and talk to us. And he was talking about Roth IRAs and investing even just $50 a month. I knew my friend really well. And if she married this guy who's talking about this thing that the College of Pharmacy thought it was important enough to bring a speaker in to talk to us about, I'm going to talk to this guy afterwards. And I did. I started a Roth IRA back in the year 2000, I believe.
That's awesome.
Yeah, $50 a month. And then I just kind of built it. And since then, we've had the same financial advisor firm. I guess they've built this firm up quite a bit. So we've built our investments over the years. But if I hadn't started my financial literacy journey there in the year 2000, I wouldn't be now where I am.
Yeah, the financial literacy piece in colleges, I'm glad you mentioned your example of the Roth IRA and how important the early contributions are. We're all told that, right? Time value money, contribute as early as you can. And sometimes that sticks, sometimes it doesn't. But one of the things we have noticed is a real increase in the number of colleges and university that are wanting to bring financial literacy into the pharmacy curriculum, which is really exciting, right? Because I think it's something that I felt like, I didn't have in my own journey and wasn't equipped with that knowledge. And really excited to see how many colleges are saying, hey, this is a priority, just like you had that session. Some schools have a whole course. Sometimes it's an elective. Sometimes it's just a single session. But hopefully we'll see more of that happening into the future. And ideally it's happening throughout the curriculum. I often will talk with a group at graduation and they'll give me 2, 3, 4 hours and it's like eyes gloss over, right? Whoa, this is a lot of information at once. And it is. And especially when they're at that transition point. But ideally we're able to kind of hit on throughout the semester so that they can build on that knowledge while they're in school.
Thank you for commenting on that. We're going to go off on a tangent real quick. Didn't you recently develop a relationship with the American Pharmacists Association to help educate students about financial literacy?
Yeah. And I think this is a really good synergy with the podcast discussion because one of the things I've realized, Kim, through my podcasting journey is it's really led to some awesome collaborations. And some of those have been business related. Some of them have just been really cool personal relationships. But I do think that our podcast has in part led to our collaboration with the American Pharmacists Association. And we've been involved with them actually for several years, helping their members, student members, new practitioner members, pharmacist members with financial wellness. And so that's included webinars, it's included articles and some live events and sessions that we've done. But I do think that the reach that we've had with the podcast and the awareness of it has helped to pave the way and foster some of the collaborations that we have.
Awesome. Yes, I love it when something good happens because of a podcast. There's so many opportunities. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a good segue into the why. Like, why did you start this podcast? It wasn't to get this deal with the American Pharmacists Association, this collaboration, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you didn't wait 6 years or whatever it was to get that collaboration. Why did you start your Financial Pharmacist podcast?
Yeah, I would be lying if I didn't say that there was some initial thought that this might be an important part of the business as we looked at growing it into the future. And it has led to the growth of the business over the last 7 years. So people being aware of who we are and what we do through the podcast as a means of growing that awareness. I didn't know exactly where that would go or how it would look, or that we would be doing it 7.5 years later. But I thought, hey, this is an important medium. It's a growing medium. And I think it leans into an area that I like, which is teaching and interviewing other people. So I was trying to align my interests with the medium that I thought would be the most valuable. And it was all about really trying to ignite a conversation among pharmacists. That was the vision. So I felt like in my journey, paying off way too much student loan debt, trying to learn some of the nuances in the financial literacy that we talked about, I really felt like I was living on an island in that journey. And I think that's pretty normal where people, whether it's they've got high debt loads or they feel like they should be further along in their investing, whatever might be the financial feelings that they're having, because we don't talk enough about this topic, getting better, but I still don't think we talk enough openly about personal finance. That can lead to feelings of isolation or, hey, am I the only one that's making a pretty darn good income, but I feel financially overwhelmed, stressed, anxious, and frustrated? And just as an aside, if you're listening and you feel that, I can assure you that you're not alone. And I remember thinking that in my own journey of like, man, do I not have this figured out, but everyone else does? Like, am I alone in this? And, when we start to talk about it, when we start to open up, when we start to share stories, I think that's when we really can ignite this conversation where people can feel comfortable, they can feel safe. And from that place, we can then start to build, hopefully without a lot of self-judgment and a lot of shame of whatever may be the case in our own journey. So I really felt like the podcast was an important way that we could open up this conversation in our profession, that I could share my own story, but over time be able to share other people's stories and hopefully increase the financial literacy within our profession as well. And when we started this back in 2017, at the time, there really wasn't a voice that was what I say is kind of the pharmacist to pharmacist personal finance. There was your listeners might be familiar with the White Coat Investor, which is a physician who talks a lot about personal finance, started with a blog, evolved to a podcast and other mediums. Lots of resources out there for physicians and healthcare professionals at large. But we really didn't have a piece that I felt like was addressing these things within our profession. And so that was the opportunity that I saw and one that I could align my own interests with the medium in which hopefully I could teach and inspire others.
You claimed your niche is what you did.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I didn't know that term at the time, but that was the idea. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. When you started your Financial Pharmacist podcast back in 2017, like you talked about, was it just you by yourself or were there others with you?
That's a great question, Kim, because there were three Tims involved with Your Financial Pharmacist back at the time in 2017. So Tim Church and I, who's a VA pharmacist down in West Palm Beach, he and I wrote the book, Seven Figure Pharmacist. We co-authored that. Tim was actually a former student of mine, probably the smartest student I ever had, to be frank. And Tim Baker, I had met right about the time, who's a fee-only certified financial planner, my current partner in the business. And so Tim Baker and I started the podcast as we were kind of trying to figure out, like, what does this business look like between the three of us? So to answer your question directly, it was Tim Baker and I really talking about it from a pharmacy and personal finance side, bringing his expertise into the equation on the show.
I remember when there were three Tims and your website had all three of you with your microphones in front of you.
Yes.
I remember that. I mean, I'm not laughing because it was funny to look at. It was just, I mean, what are the odds of finding three people named Tim to all talk about the same topic? It was really cool.
Pretty wild,
but at the
right?
same time, yes, quite the coincidence. Yes,
for sure.
Like a cool coincidence. Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about the genesis of the podcast. I believe that on one of the other episodes that I had you on as a guest, you were talking about how you also blogged before you started your Financial Pharmacist podcast. How are the two related? Which one came first?
Yeah, the blog came first. So that's how I actually started Your Financial Pharmacist. The very first blog, which is still up there. I look at it often and I'm like, wow, did I really write it that way?
How old is that, by the way?
2015, November 6th, 2015. And the reason I remember that date, it's kind of what I think of as the beginning of the business. So I wrote a blog post that shared my journey of going through the debt repayment. I talked about how, hey, I was a six-figure pharmacist, like many of the people out there that are listening, but really feeling some of the emotional things I described earlier: confused, overwhelmed, stressed, frustrated, anxious. And I talked about that journey and how that debt-free journey was so important for us. So that was the first blog. And really the blog was the primary medium for the first, I would say, year and a half. And then that flipped with the podcast, and the podcast has remained the primary source and medium of what we have done since then. I think part to what I mentioned earlier, like, it's the medium I enjoy the most. And I say that because for people that are creators getting started, I think it's important to align your strengths, your interests with the medium that you might choose, right? Whether people start a YouTube channel, whether they start a podcast, they start a blog, they start a newsletter, like, what do you enjoy doing? And I do like writing a lot, but I love getting on the microphone and just talking about people's stories and learning about why people do what they do and how they did things, and trying to tell those stories in a way that can be relatable and digestible to other people. So when we started the podcast in 2017, it really, I would say, kind of flipped at that point. We still do blog periodically, but it's probably 10 to 1, I would say, where for every, maybe even more than that, maybe 20 to 1 podcast we do, we might do a blog article here or there, really focusing our time and effort on growing the podcast and really leaning into that medium where we felt like there was the most engagement and interest that we were hearing from our community.
Pharmacists are busy. We read so many things other than for personal pleasure, and or self-help, which is what I feel like your content falls under the banner of. Putting it into audio, that's something people can consume on the go in their free time.
And that's how I was consuming. I would still do at times. I kind of go hot or cold. But, if I'm driving, which I don't drive as much into the office anymore, but when I would regularly listen to 2, 3, 4 shows. Now it might be walking, but I love to be able to have that space where, hey, I can spend 20, 30, 35 minutes and learn something new. I remember how important some of those podcasts were early on in my journey, like the Bigger Pockets real estate podcast. It was like a whole new education was unfolded without some of the barrier structure and confines of more traditional educational systems and structures. And I was like, whoa, like, this is a library to go learn whatever you want, however you want to learn it, at whatever speed you want to learn it. And that was really an important mindset shift for me as we thought about growing our podcast of, hey, can we create a library of content and resources that people can go listen, learn, and do so at whatever pace and whatever topics they're most interested in. So we might have a listener now who jumps on the show and maybe they're fresh out of pharmacy school and student loans are staring them in the face. So, to your suggestion, they want to go find all the student loan repayment stories and strategies. Whereas someone else is listening, they might be a little bit later in their career and they're really interested in Social Security strategies or retirement withdrawal strategies. Whereas a new practitioner might look at that and say, that's interesting, but like doesn't mean anything to me right now. Right. So really trying to find how we could marry the content and the stories with pharmacists that are all different stages of their journey, which I think is one of the hardest things about the topic that we talk about, is that there are so many nuances of personal finance. And then within that, depending on where you're at in your own journey, there's different layers of what may be of most interest in the moment. And that can make it challenging at times when you're speaking in a podcast environment to really get specific on like, what are you talking about and who are you talking to?
Knowing your audience is important. So I feel like with the different segments of conversations that you have to be kind of specific, I think, in the title of the episode. Yeah. How this person repaid all this debt, or you have somebody who is trying to withdraw their investment upon retirement. I know you've got quite the spectrum. So I think titling things correctly and just speaking to the audience when you do a specific episode for that specific audience is important. I know that according to my podcast player, you have 684 episodes over 7.5 years.
Wow.
And yeah, I think a year or two ago, you had mentioned that you have more than 1 million downloads. So you're reaching a broad audience, a lot of people. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I actually didn't know it was 600. We're getting ready to publish, I think, episode 383. So we've got a few different formats that has evolved over the years. But our main show is every Thursday, which is more of our long form type of content. We then do a short segment once a week that's on Tuesdays where we answer a quick question or talk about a hot topic, 5, 10, 15 minutes or less. And then we've got a real estate show that's been published for several years, about once or twice a month. I think there are 120, 125 episodes in or so. So I didn't know the aggregate number was in the 600s, which is really cool. I should know that, I guess.
According to Apple Podcasts, which is what my podcast player is, 684.
We're almost ready to cross 2 million downloads, which is super cool. And we're really excited about that. But while that number is exciting, what I get more excited about is the people that will reach out and say, hey, Tim, I listened to Brandon's story, where he paid off debt, and it really inspired, my wife and I, or my partner and I, in our own journey to do X, Y, or Z. Or, I listened to Brooke's story on episode 379 about her entrepreneurial journey, and it really helped me think about how I might be able to pair my full-time career, which I like doing what I'm doing, and I don't want to leave that work, but also maybe pursuing some other ways to grow my income, achieve my goals, and pursue something I'm passionate about. So I love that feedback where people will say, hey, because of the content, because of what was published, it helped spark or ignite something that they then took action in their own financial plan. Like that to me means everything when we talk about why we're doing what we're doing, because I think that's where we really start to have some of the long-term impact. When I think about our own journey, it was really for us kind of waking up, to be frank, saying we've got to do this differently, figuring out that path, and then what that unlocked for us and our family, and hopefully for our boys and their families in the future. Really, you start to get in some of those, long-term benefits and some of the longer-term impact. And if we can play even just a really small role in that for other people, that gets me excited. And I think that's why I remain to be so passionate about what we're doing on the podcast, even, 600 and something episodes in.
Yes, you are definitely changing lives for sure. I like that you talked about helping people take action. Helping people take action is really what you want. You want them to make a plan and then follow through on it, right?
That's right. And it takes motivation, it takes a sense of motivation that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And that's one of the things that I'm hopeful we do is because I think any of us can hear a story and get excited, and then that can fizzle out over time. And so one of the things I love about the podcast medium is that, especially if someone continues to engage as a listener, can there be that ongoing dose and injection of support, every so often? And that doesn't mean we're going to get this right all the time. That doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes, right? I know it's something we're constantly doing in our own journey where we're like, hey, we could have done that better. Or you'll get in those lull periods where you feel like you're in a rut. All of that is normal. But can we be on the upward trajectory overall, knowing that there's going to be some dips along the way? And I think that sense of, hey, I'm not at this alone. Other people are on this journey as well. And really hearing some of those sources of inspiration and motivation and nudges when they're needed can be really helpful to people staying on track for the long term, which is what really matters when it comes to the financial plan.
Yes. So having a plan is one thing, staying motivated is another.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I bet you've read James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say you've probably met James Clear, right?
I have not met James Clear.
I hear he lives in Columbus, Ohio.
Does
Is
he
that
really?
True? Somebody told me that. Yeah, Megan Marshall told me that.
Well, now I'm going to have to figure out a way to meet James Clear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like part of what you do is kind of like what he talks about with building habits. I mean, you really have to break it down, have a plan. You need to make it easy. You need to make it attractive, make it doable. I can't remember. I can't, quote it from the book. But I feel like that's part of what you help people do. With your business, that is.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes out from what I've figured out does and doesn't work in my own plan that I try to bring forward. So one example of that can be in automation. I'm a huge believer in automation in the financial plan because automation is really the antidote to our human behavior. And we'll make mistakes if it's up to us as irrational decision makers, right? Money is very emotional. And we tend to look at things in a silo. And automation really cuts through a lot of that because once you set your goals and once you set a plan to work those, if you can turn on the system, we like to create systems where then that's working for us, boom, that's where really things start to take off. And I remember first hearing about this from Ramit Sethi, who wrote the book, I'll Teach You to Be Rich. And I heard a keynote from him at a conference several years ago. And it was like a no-brainer. Like it's all about developing a system that works for you so that we can really ensure and have momentum and confidence that things are moving forward. And we're not constantly revisiting these same questions over and over again. Or as I often say, getting these unclosed loops that are always swirling in our mind, right? Am I on track for retirement? When does it make sense to buy this investment property? Should I be saving more for my kids' college, right? We can answer all these questions, but these are things that just constantly remain as stressors for so many people that we just need to put on the paper, come up with a plan with. Sure, things are going to change. We got to react and figure that out, but then turn it on automatic so we can get ourselves the heck out of the way. I interviewed Daniel Crosby on the podcast probably 3 years ago. He wrote the book called The Behavioral Investor. He's a PhD that studies the psychology of money, basically. And one of the things he shares is if you look at the long-term behaviors of those that are successful with investing versus those that are not, it's the people that can develop a lot of the systems and get their own irrational decision-making out of the way. And I say that with humility that I know that to be true for myself. So how can we develop the systems, the tools, the behaviors? So much of this topic is behavioral. I mean, sure, at some point you got to have a difference between your income and expenses so you can put it towards whatever goal. And if we don't have that margin, we're not going to achieve a whole lot. Absolutely. But once we establish that margin, it's really about behavior. It's about systems, and it's about those things working for us so that we can get some of our own self out of the way that might prevent us from achieving those things.
I know what you mean about automation. It helps you make good decisions because otherwise we want that easy win now. We just want to enjoy that money and the things that it'll buy now. And it's hard to set aside the money so that we can enjoy it later. But if you just automate it and have that payroll deduction or whatever it is, it takes your brain out of it a little bit so you can focus on that long-term goal. Hey, Tim, would you say that you have a business with a podcast at this point?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate, Kim. I don't think it started that way. When I think about the journey of what I now think of the business of your financial pharmacist, it really started as a hobby that was an educational hobby that turned into a side hustle that evolved to the business when we started to see the demand and interest in what we were doing. And the early stages of the podcast were in that hobby to side hustle phase, right? And now when I look at the business and the current state of the business, certainly the educational mission remains of why we started it. That's unchanged, but it is a very important source to us when it comes to growing the business as well.
Tim, on the topic of being a business with a podcast, what advice do you have for future podcasters about being a business with a podcast?
Yeah, I do like the synergy of the podcast as a means of growing the business or growing the brand or awareness of what you're doing. I think I would encourage people, though, to start with really a curiosity and a desire to add value and see what does or doesn't resonate with the community and how that does or doesn't validate the idea of whatever business or whatever idea you're trying to grow. And then I think it might be more clear as time passes of how could this podcast potentially serve as a way to grow the business. I think the challenge with starting there, especially if you don't know your audience really well, is you may be making some assumptions along the way. And I think there can be some resistance. I know I have felt this at times, some resistance where when you're producing content with a direct goal of growing the business, not that that's a bad thing, but it's different than when you're producing content with a goal to have an impact, to have a transformation, to provide value. And what you will learn through that journey and what people are telling you can then help inform future content as well as maybe even inform what you're doing in terms of your product or your service offering. So I know for us, like what I often share are some of the biggest pain points we hear, which is, hey, Tim, I'm overwhelmed and confused with my student loan debt. I'm frustrated that I make a good income and I'm not progressing financially, and I'm not sure about how to best budget, save, and invest for the future. Those are not my words. Those are words that we heard on repeat from pharmacists in our community that came from podcast listeners, came from people that were engaging in our community and platform. So I think starting, you're trying to get your best guess, right, of what are people interested in, and what's going to be the topics and the content you're talking about, but going from a place of service, adding value with a curiosity and a willingness to hear and get some feedback is really important. My partner, Tim, calls this the 1,000 cups of coffee, which I love this concept. So when you're starting something, having as many conversations as you can, not about like, I'm selling this, are you interested? But just really trying to understand what is the problem that people are having and can you solve that problem? And then if you can, what does that offering look like? It could be a product, it could be a service, and what are you going to charge for it? We often inverse those things, right? Because we get excited about a business idea and it's like, hey, here's my product or service, here's what it costs. When we aren't even sure if we're solving a problem that people care about, nonetheless, are they willing to pay for it? Right. So I love that. And that curiosity of, hey, what's going on, whatever is the domain that you're interested in building something around, asking some really good open-ended questions and just stopping talking, listening to what people have to say. And that will produce a really interesting content plan because you're going to find out exactly what people are interested in.
I really appreciate you talking about coming from a place of service instead of trying to monetize immediately. Because I think when you come from a place of service, your heart's in the right place. And eventually people's heads will lead them to you because they know that you have something to offer that they are willing to pay for. Now, you talked about audience and having the 1,000 cups of coffee. How do you know who your audience is when you're a podcaster?
I think that's tough, right? There are some tools and demographics out there that will tell you about who's listening, age, gender, what countries, all that kind of stuff. Our experience has been that that's just a learning curve overall. So I started the podcast speaking from my stage of career, my experiences, and I was speaking directly from that point of view. So it was very much a new practitioner focus, right? At the time, I was about 7 or 8 years out. I had just gotten to that point of, hey, we finished paying off our student loan debt. We're now trying to figure out kind of what's next. Had this nagging feeling that we make a good income, but this shouldn't be as hard as it is. Why don't people talk more about this, right? That's where all the content came from. And then that's evolved over time as my career has evolved, as our listenership has evolved, and as new people have found our podcast and our show, where I'd say we've transitioned to have content not only for that group, but also for pharmacists that are in the middle of their career and for pharmacists that are in the second half of their career. So we haven't solved the Rubik's Cube of this yet. Like if you were to say like, hey, Tim, exactly who is your listener? I've got a rough idea. It tends to be, pharmacists that are within the first half-ish of their career. We know that it's student loan debt. We know that it's home buying. We know that it's getting started with investing. But that's shifting and moving, which makes sense because we've been doing this now for over 7 years, right? So we have some people that hey, at the very beginning, they wanted more and more and more student loan stuff. And now they're like, Tim, stop talking about student loans. Like, we got it, right? So I think there is an evolution that naturally happens over there, but we haven't done the best of jobs, admittedly, of engaging with our community through things like listener surveys or other types of things to identify what is the demographic, what's the makeup of the listenership, and then how can we best serve that audience.
It is tricky figuring out who your audience is because you kind of don't know unless they contact you.
That's right.
Or they come up to you at a conference. Tim, how many times has somebody come up to you at a conference and said, I love your podcast, and then you know who they are?
Yes, that happens. And it's usually followed by some type of financial confession. I don't know why this happens, but usually it's, hey, Tim, I listened to this show. I love it. By the way, like, let me tell you about something that just happened because I need to tell something. Like, I'm not a priest, like, right. But, it's funny. And I think I joke about that, but it really gives me a lot of joy because it tells me that we've created a safe environment. And I love that, right? Because if we can feel like we can be vulnerable and safe, that's a really good place we can work from when it comes to the financial plan.
Thank you for talking about that. I know that when it comes to podcasting, downloads also give you some information. I don't know about you, but I have that one episode that has like 10,000 downloads. And I know that people liked it and they want more of it. And when I've given them more of similar types of episodes, they've downloaded it again in the hundreds, if not thousands. Mm-hmm. So would you like to comment on downloads telling you information about what podcast episodes are popular?
Yeah, we do look at this and track it on a regular basis. And you're right, there are those that stand out. I think generally speaking, it's the stories we talked about. It's the debt-free stories. It's the millionaire stories. It's the entrepreneurial stories. And then I would say a close second to that would be some of the like bigger names that we've had on the show. So our most downloaded episode, I believe, of all time is I had the opportunity to have Susie Orman on the show in episode 109.
I heard that one, yeah.
That was a really cool opportunity. I had the opportunity to interview Rachel Cruz from the Ramsey team. That was a cool opportunity. Those drew big numbers, as well as some other authors that we've had on the show. And while those are cool and they've been a lot of fun, I still think it's the pharmacist stories, right? Because, as much as people like listening to Susie Orman or Rachel Cruz or whomever, if they hear a pharmacist like Brandon or like Mike Byers, who shared his Millionaire Theme Hour story, I think we can start to connect with that and say, oh, like I could see myself on a path similar to that, or I can take something away from this because that person understands the journey that I'm on as well. So that's what the data tells us when it comes to our show.
Thanks for talking about the data. Pharmacists love data,
I know,
right?
We do, don't we?
Absolutely. Now, along the same lines, I'm going to ask you for a number. Do you happen to have an episode number that you think my audience should check out?
I've got a few. I know you're asking for one, but I think these are 3 recent episodes, so people don't have to go back through the archives. And I've referenced a couple of them already, but they give an example in a few different ways of some of the stories that we see this people really resonate with. So 365 was a millionaire theme hour I did with Mike Byers, a pharmacist out of Pittsburgh. And he shared his story going from a net worth of 0 to becoming a 7-figure pharmacist. Really cool story of just patience, diligence. He's got some real estate investing as a part of his portfolio as well. But it's not a story you hear and you're like, oh, he's doing all these complicated, nuanced investment strategies. It's a really fairly boring story. And that's the point, right? If we're diligent over a long period of time, compound interest, time value of money, it does its job, right? Just like your $50 Roth IRA will reap big benefits in the future. We also had a debt-free story recently with Brandon Gerleman. I mentioned that earlier. That was episode 376. That was a really fantastic interview. And then 379, we had Brooke Griffin on the show that talked about her entrepreneurial journey. And we've had several of these, an area we've focused on more in the last couple of years, trying to really highlight pharmacists, whether it be a business they're growing or a side hustle, ways in which what I call they're monetizing their expertise. Often that might be clinical expertise. In the case of Brooke, that was some of her academic and career expertise that she has in career coaching. What I love about Brooke's story in particular is that I think in the current day of entrepreneurship and side hustles, there can be a fascination with, hey, I want to leave what I'm doing altogether and go pursue A, B, or C. And for some people, that might be the move to make, but for 95+%, it's not. And, with Brooke's story, it was really like, hey, I enjoy what I do as an academic. I love my work as a pharmacist, but I also have this passion over here that I have an opportunity to go pursue and help others and provide value. And her story is very value-based. So that would be a third one that I would mention as well.
Thank you for mentioning those. Episodes 365, 376, and 379, right?
You got it. Yep.
All right, I'll put links to those in the show notes. Tim, I've got to ask you kind of a selfish question. What's in it for you? Why do you have a podcast? Like, what do you get out of it?
Yeah, I haven't been shy about the value to the business, right? We consistently see referrals that come to us from, hey, I've listened to the podcast for 2 years. And I think in our industry, there very much is a building of trust. And I think hearing someone's voice and developing the relationship can do that. We also have many, many people that have listened to the podcast for years that may not work with us for a variety of reasons. And that's okay too. So there is certainly a business component. I do think for me though, however, when I look back in 10, 15, 20 years, I think the greatest joy I'm going to have is through the transformation and the impact that has happened. I actually keep a folder. I use Notion for kind of all my note-taking types of things. And I have a folder when people reach out, I just quickly dump them in there because I don't want to forget that. There are seasons of growing a business where sometimes you just feel like you're getting kicked in the face. And it's hard to zoom out of those valleys. And I think it's so important, especially if you're in a service-based type of business or environment, to remind yourself of, hey, what is the impact? What's the transformation of this work that's happening? And I think that's the one thing I'll look back at and say, I'm so glad we went on that journey.
I think that's very validating that your work matters. Yeah, good for you. Tim, I'm going to ask you some quick questions. I know we're coming up against time here.
Yeah.
Where can my audience find your podcast?
Best place to go would be on our website, yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You can also just search Your Financial Pharmacist on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your show.
Awesome. Thank you. And Tim, people think about starting podcasts all the time. What advice do you have for new podcasters?
My one piece of advice, easier said than done, would be don't overthink it. And I think for a lot of pharmacists, there can be some fear and anxiety of, hey, do I have everything right? How's this going to be perceived by others? What's this going to look like? Where's it going to go? And that can easily lead to paralysis. One of my favorite books when I started the business was called Start by John Acuff. And I needed to hear those words when I had the initial idea of YFP. I think many pharmacists could use those words as well, which is just start. It's not going to be perfect. You're inevitably going to go back. I did recently and listen to episode 1 and be like, oh, wow, is that what the audio sounded like? Did I really ask questions that way? And I think if we're doing this right, it's always a learning growth phase that we're going to be in. And hopefully 7 years from now, I look back and say, wow, is that really what we did 7 years ago, right? And continue to evolve it. So I think recognizing that it's never going to be perfect. And I even would say that's true in the editing phases. You know, for us, we do editing here or there, but I think part of the feel of an organic conversation is letting for some of the natural flow. And that could mean some imperfections that are here and there, and not getting so paralyzed by what's this going to look like from a post-production standpoint? Is it as perfect as I would like it to be? Because if you've got a great idea to share and you really feel like you can add value and be of service to others, like holding that back is a disservice. And so can we overcome some of those fears and anxieties so you can share whatever are the gifts that you want to share with other people?
Right. Be brave, feel the fear, do it anyway.
That's right. That's right.
Good advice. Appreciate that. Thank you. Tim, do you have anything coming up here as 2024 comes to a close that you would like to promote?
Please check out our website. We've got always new content, resources, yourfinancialpharmacist.com. We hope we can provide some value, whatever stage that you're in of your career. So lots of free content available at the website.
I would second that. Lots of free content there. Yep. Tim, this episode comes out on Black Friday.
Woo!
Black Friday is typically the US version of like you get good deals on all kinds of cool stuff. So for anybody looking to buy podcasting gear on Black Friday, what do you recommend they buy on Black Friday if they can find a good deal?
Yeah, this should be a question for you, probably not for me, right? You're the expert in this space. I'll tell you the equipment that I use, but again, this is one where it's like, don't overthink it. I remember initially we had this long planning document of like all these different options for editing software and microphones and swing arms and boom mics. I don't even know what all the terms are, right? And it's like you can go down a deep rabbit hole there and give yourself another reason never to get started. So I have a Shure mic. I think it was a few $100. It wasn't the first mic that I started with. We use a tool called Zencaster for our recording. I know you use a tool called Squadcast. So again, lots of options that are out there. And then I've got a simple Razer mic and camera that I use. Not only helpful for any video conferencing, but if we ever record video and share that with our podcast, it's a pretty high quality video output as well. So keep it simple, doesn't have to break the budget. And again, where you start probably isn't where you're going to be in a couple of years. So just get started.
I appreciate that. Sometimes people like permission to buy stuff. And when you talk about what equipment you have, they might think it's okay to buy the good mic when they start out too. I didn't buy the good mic, the Shure SM7B, until, about 4 years into podcasting, maybe 4.5. Okay. Yeah. I just started off with an Audio-Technica 2100.
Same. I had the same mic for the first 3 years. Yeah.
That's the recipe for good podcasting, man. Yeah. All right. Thank you for sharing that. And at this time, we're going to wrap this up. Tim, is there anything else you'd like to share?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come on. Always enjoy the conversation and love the work that you're doing at the Pharmacist Voice. So thank you for allowing me to be a guest.
The pleasure's all mine. Thanks for being back for the third time on the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Dr. Tim Ulbrich for being my guest today on the Pharmacist Voice podcast, episode 306. We covered a lot during our conversation, and the one theme that stood out most to me about your Financial Pharmacist podcast is that content is king. YFP Podcast publishes more than one episode per week, which is not something that every podcaster can do. And his podcast covers a spectrum of topics. There's a little bit of something for many types of listeners. I love that I can go back through the YFP Podcast back catalog, as I call it, or old episodes, as some others might call it, and just pick out my favorite type of episode or episodes that appeal to me and speak to me where I'm at on my financial journey with my husband here in the year 2024. When you have about 700 episodes, there's a lot to offer. If you want to check out my interview with Tim on his show, look for YFP Podcast episode 279. That was from the year 2022. It's kind of fun to listen to stuff like that years later and think about, where was I at in my journey? At this time, I'd like to do a brief recap of our conversation. Then I will share some of my Black Friday picks with you. Then we'll wrap up this episode. Your Financial Pharmacist podcast has been running for 7.5 years and has almost 700 episodes and nearly 2 million downloads. The podcast features various formats, including debt-free stories, real estate discussions, and educational content. Tim emphasized the importance of financial literacy, and he shared success stories like Brandon Gerleman's $160,000 debt repayment and Mike Byers' journey to becoming a 7-figure pharmacist. Tim highlighted the podcast's role in fostering community and providing actionable financial advice, which has led to significant business growth and personal satisfaction. As a reminder, Tim recommends episodes 365, 376, and 379 of YFP Podcast. Links to all three of those are in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. I enjoyed hearing Tim's insights into why he started his show, who his audience is, the financial confessions that he hears when he meets his audience in person at conferences. That was fun to hear about. He talked about his partnership with the American Pharmacists Association and how that happened because of his podcast. Advice for new podcasters, including some tools and gear, a reminder about the resources on his website, and more. Tim is a very generous guest and always brings a ton of value to my audience. Thanks again, Tim. And at this point, I will share a couple of tools and gear that you should consider if you are interested in starting a podcast. Everybody always wants to know about the microphone. So for a microphone, I recommend either the Audio-Technica 2100, which again is what Tim and I both started on, or the Samson Q2U. I'll have links to both of those in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. And just in case you're wondering, those are both USB and XLR microphones. They go both ways. For recording software, I recommend Audacity if you're a beginner because it's free and there are many online communities that you can learn from as you get started. Join a Facebook group, you can Google stuff. The Audacity community is huge. And a personal note about audio engineering, just from me to you, audio engineering is hard at first. I'm not going to lie. But if I can do it, you can do it. And you need to hear that more than you know. Just a few more comments about tools and gear, and then I'll wrap this up. If you need remote interview recording software, I recommend the Zoom free version. I recommend you separate the host and guest tracks if possible. So as you get started, just use the free version of Zoom and keep your recording short because I think you only get 40 minutes of total runtime on the Zoom free version. You can always upgrade to the paid version of Zoom down the road if you need more time, more than the 40 minutes or whatever they give you for free. But you can also upgrade to a different program. I use Squadcast, and Tim talked about using Zencastr. So again, we used Squadcast today to record our podcast interview, and Tim used Zencastr back in the day 2 years ago when we had our interview on his show. There you go. As for a computer, just use the one that you already own. You do not have to buy a new computer. Just make sure that your operating system works with the recording program you choose. As for something to hear your interview with, you always want to be wearing earbuds if you have an interview or you need something to listen closely with when you're listening to the playback of a solo show. Just use some cheap earbuds as you get started. No need to go all out until you know that podcasting is right for you. I say start for like $100 or less, which is what I'm talking about here on the show today, and upgrade later as you mature as a podcaster. The very biggest investment in your podcast will be your time. That is the truth. That's a big reason that I recommend you look at my free ebook or listen to the audiobook version. And again, you can find both of those on kimnewlove.com. Just go ahead and go to kimnewlove.com/podcasting. Or you can book time with me or take my self-paced online course. That's $249. I can help you flatten the learning curve. If you're a busy pharmacist and you get frustrated with podcasting, it can happen. Please reach out. I know I can help you. And with that, I thank you very much for listening to episode 306 of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. Go to thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes, you will find many, many links today. You will find a link to Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, the podcast episodes, the business, and the Facebook group, a link to Tim Ulbrich PharmD on LinkedIn, the podcast interviews mentioned in this episode, a link to my online store and social media links, and more. Lots and lots of links today. Everything you need is on thepharmacistvoice.com. If you know someone who might like to learn about Your Financial Pharmacist podcast or invite Dr. Tim Ulbrich to speak to their group, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist's Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you have had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Get yourself some Black Friday and Cyber Monday deals, and I will talk to you next week.